Hey, hey, hey. Emily, can you hear me all right?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, let's do this. Can you see the slides?
Yep,
No.
yep, I can see him.
Do the slides move?
They're not moving right now.
For some reason, this is a perennial problem in all my classes. I don't know what the answer is. Let's try this again.
Mm.
Okay, do they move?
Now they're moving, yeah.
Now they're moving.
Mm-hmm.
Now you're going to ask me what I did differently. Absolutely nothing.
It just decided to work.
Yeah, don't ask me to figure it out. I have no answers. Okay, we're going to get started here in about a minute and then we'll dive on in. Okay. Okay, gang, it's time. It's good to see many back. Seems like in at least some of my classes, some people come back and then I get a new wave of people now who are under quarantine. So the number of people actually in class never really goes up. So it just the faces change, which is a little frustrating, but you know, it is what it is. So today we're going to talk about epidemiology. Let's see, whose is this? Oh, well done as usual. And then after this, we will dive into the immune response, looking first at the innate immune response, which is not adaptive and does not remember infections, and then going from the innate immune response to the adaptive immune response, which has memory and can adapt for different infections, and so on and so forth. Let's have a word of prayer and let's dive in, Father. Thank you for a little today. Thank you for reminding us that winter is upon us. Thank you for the seasons. Thank you for the leaves that fall, that get renewed the following season. Thank you for the changes. Thank you for new life. Thank you for getting us in the semester. Thank you, Lord, for a very courageous monk who over 500 years ago nailed his 95 thesis to the door of the Pittsburgh church and said, essentially, I protest. Lord, may protest be as well informed as his. In Jesus' name, amen. Yes, in fact, Reformation Day was November 1st. That was the day all Marty Luther put his 95 theses on the door of the Wittenberg Church, and the Protestant Reformation at least was begun. Okay, so let's talk about epidemiology. So we looked at how organisms interact with individuals to cause disease, but we must remember that microorganisms interact with a very diverse population of people. And so the study of how diseases interact with human populations, that is essentially epidemiology, how disease interacts with human populations. And an epidemiologist is concerned with how microorganisms are transmitted within a population, how that disease is caused, and the dynamics of that disease within the population. That is an epidemiologist. When we use the term etiology, it means it's a study of how a disease is caused. So what is the etiology of tuberculosis? It's the microorganism, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. What's the etiology of COVID-19? It's the coronavirus SARS-CoV-2. The severe acute respiratory syndrome, coronavirus number 2. And COVID-19 is a coronavirus caused infectious disease discovered in 2019. That's its name, COVID-19. So for this, we're going to need to knock out some terminology here right at the get-go. So incidence. These are the number of new cases. Number of new cases at any one time. Number of new cases at any one time. So when you go, say, to the Johns Hopkins sites, and you look at the number of cases of COVID-19 all around the world, those numbers, there are two numbers it'll give you. One is new cases. Do any of you, are any of you on Facebook, LinkedIn, to the CDC COVID-19? Do you get the COVID-19 updates on your phone? Well, you can get them, they're free. If you get them, let's see. Let's see if I have one of these. It'll tell you, it'll read your location on your phone. So it'll give the number of new cases right in your area. Well, of course, the election's coming up, so the political junk just really gets, here we go. Coronavirus Information Center. You can get updates, you get them once a week so they don't overcrowd your phone. So it shows you number of cases in Jackson County, updated 5 hours ago, 2,004 cases yesterday. So that would be incidence. And then if you click on that, well, you tap on that, it will essentially show you each incidence, but then it will actually give you running numbers if you want. And again, it'll show you total number of cases, incidents essentially for Michigan, then do the same thing for the United States as well. And then you can get the actual prevalence, that is total number of cases. So Michigan, our prevalence is 197,406. We're 14th in the US, in case you want. And our incidence, according to this, is 3,542. And we've got 7,699 deaths of those 197,406. So prevalence, total number of cases. Incidence, new cases. New, total. new total. Now these, as you can see, will usually be per geographic area, per geographic area. So you could do it for Jackson County, Hillsdale County, whatever county, Washtenaw County, whatever. You could do it for the state of Michigan. You could do it for the US. Heck, you could do it for North America. So it'll be per certain geographic area and what have you. Morbidity. Morbidity. These are the number of people infected. Number of people infected. This is usually reported per 100,000 people. Per 100,000 people. Number of people who die from it, that's the mortality rate. That's usually reported either as a percentage of the number of people who get infected who die from it, or per 100,000 people. If you are interested in epidemiology, the Center for Disease Control publishes a free rag, I guess you could call it. It's the MMWR, the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, the MMWR. And it gets in your mailbox every week, and it talks about kind of new and new data, essentially, any diseases that are kind of up and coming. And now, of course, just about every MMWR has to do with COVID. But it has lots of interesting stuff on interesting diseases out there. If you're interested in that, you can get it sent to your mailbox for free. And it is an interesting read. Usually it's pretty short. They do special reports sometimes on specific diseases that tend to be longer. Some of those special reports are sweet. They have a lot of really great info, and they always have a great bibliography if you want to read up more about. They did a really nice one on Lyme disease 2 years ago. Then there was another one on tuberculosis. They do one on tuberculosis every 4 years or so because the data needs updating. They talk about new vaccines, new drugs, new treatments, what have you. If you kind of don't like digging in the literature and you like review articles about stuff and you want to read up on it every now and then, I highly recommend that report for you. It's worth your time to read it. Most time it's pretty short too. You can get through it in a lunch break. Endemic means that the infection is already present at some low level in the population. It's not at a high enough frequency to cause public health concern. Case in point, chickenpox in the US. Even with the vaccine, you still have plenty of kids who get chickenpox. You have chickenpox that kind of run through church nurseries or daycare centers or something like that. That's becoming less and less of an issue now with the vaccination. But chickenpox would be an example of a disease that's endemic in the US. California in the southwestern United States, there's a disease called San Joaquin Valley fever that's endemic to that particular part of the United States. And it is only found in dry alkaline soil, like the kind you find in Arizona and parts of Nevada and parts of the Central Valley, Southern California, so on and so forth. That's caused by a systemic fungal infection, but it's usually not very severe. That's an endemic infection in the southwestern US. If the disease starts to climb in numbers, or if it becomes more severe, then it can cause a so-called epidemic. Now you have higher than normal incidence in the population, and the morbidity and mortality rate now become high enough to pose a public health problem. That would be an epidemic. An epidemic. And if that epidemic spreads worldwide, you now have a pandemic. Pandemic. Sporadic diseases. And the book shows you this example of sporadic diseases. These are viral encephalitises. Here's another one, essentially popping up here. It just kind of they just kind of pop up. They pop up randomly. They occur in random and unpredictable patterns. There are isolated cases. They tend to even be isolated to particular geographic locations. They're not a great public health threat, albeit they might be a public health threat within that locale, but they're usually not going to spread to wider areas. So this is just an example. This is from your book of the sporadic pattern of 3 different types of viral encephalitis diseases. So in panel A, this is Eastern equine encephalitis. This, when you compare it to panel B here, that is California encephalitis. And then we compare that to Western equine encephalitis here. What do you notice about these particular patterns as you look at them? What kind of jumps out at you? They don't go like this, do they? What are those periods in between where you don't see many cases? What do you think those are? I'll give you a hint. These are vector mosquitoes. What do mosquitoes need to be able to live? To be able to lay their eggs, reproduce, what do they need? What's in here? Water. Yeah, water. Not anything else, water. Water. They need to lay their eggs in water, so they need a wet season, right? So this is probably seasonal variation according to wet and dry periods. That's probably why you get the spikes, then you get zip, then you get spikes, then you get zip, then you get spikes, then you get zip, so on and so forth. And some years, you don't get very good conditions for the particular types of mosquitoes that harbor it, or you have mosquito control programs that wipe out the mosquitoes that carry this particular type of disease. Whereas with this one, you can see it's just kind of repeating. Again, 140 cases is really not going to be something that's too much. Same thing here, not very much here, and then boom, 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 and then it kind of just levels off here like that. So these are sporadic. They occur in isolated areas. They're random. They're kind of unpredictable. Notice that the numbers here are not numbers that are going to give you a lot of pause. Also, these encephalitises, they will cause a disease that lasts for a few days, then they resolve. They usually don't have any severe sequelae, except in rare conditions. I'm sure the parents, because kids usually get them, I'm sure the parents are freaked out big time, but overall, it's not a big deal. Okay, questions so far? No questions? We will move on. What if a disease is waterborne? If a disease is waterborne, and everyone goes to that same source of water, a pump, a lake, a well, or whatever, then everyone who goes to that particular source will get sick. This is called a common source illness, common source infection, common source epidemic, whatever. So let's say Aunt Frida brings her prize-winning chicken to the church picnic. She used chicken that she kind of left out because she had frozen it. She left it out a little longer than she wanted to leave it. Then she kind of prepared it, didn't really wash her hands that well. And then half the church gets sick after the church picnic. That would be a common source infection. In a common source infection, is it being passed from person to person? No, it's just being passed from the source to person. Propagated epidemics involve transmission from person to person. So you don't have a common source. Instead, you have dispersal from one host to another, usually by via casual contact, aerosol, droplets, or something like that. So epidemiological studies can usually determine which of these you have. And this picture here, this is good old Dr. Snow, like the kind we had yesterday. He is the father of epidemiology. He cared for patients in London who suffered from cholera. Now, cholera is waterborne. If any of you do international medicine, you may care for cholera patients. It is a horrific disease. The patient gets a constant diarrhea. They can't drink water fast enough to replace all the water and electrolytes they're losing. The patient literally right before your eyes in 3 to 4 days shrivels up like a prune and dies from severe dehydration and electrolyte loss. And the treatment is electrolyte replacement. And electrolyte replacement was designed by a nurse. It was designed by a nurse who cared for cholera patients. So Snow did something that no one had really ever done then. He took the patients and he mapped out where in London they lived. And he discovered, when he looked at this, and then he mapped the pumps from where they got their water. And if you look at this, you'll notice the cases start to get more and more concentrated as you go to the Broad Street pump. Turned out the Broad Street pump was the pump that was contaminated with Vibrio cholera. By putting a lock on that pump, people now had to walk further for their water, but they were able to get water that wasn't contaminated. He essentially saved London from a cholera outbreak because of his detective work, and he is therefore the father of epidemiology. That was the first epidemiological study. This was a common source outbreak. He identified that common source, namely the Broad Street pump. Simply by doing this mapping of where people live and then interfacing on that map the pumps. Now, what would this have looked like if this was a propagated epidemic? Would it look like this? No, it would have probably, you'd have a concentration, then you'd have spread kind of further and further and further. And then depending upon where people traveled, you'd have outbreaks to the various places where people traveled and so on and so forth. That wasn't happening here. That would have been a propagated epidemic. This was a common source epidemic. So your types of epidemiological studies can be merely descriptive, where you're reporting things like number of cases and what part of this, what segment of the population happens to be affected. What are the locations where the outbreak is occurring? What are the ages? Socioeconomic statuses of people who get affected, so on and so forth. That'd be a descriptive case. Then you can have analytical types of epidemiological studies that are very mathematical. They try to put models to this. And this can get pretty deep and heavy and statistical very quickly. Then you have experimental epidemiology. This was, a good example of this was in Chicago. People wanted to know if the Chicago River was actually contaminating water sources that were coming into houses. So what these guys did is they put, you know that dye? I don't know if any of you have ever been to Chicago. On St. Patrick's Day, they dye the Chicago River with that green glowy dye. So they actually took some of this, they dumped it in the Chicago River, and then they went to these people's houses, and then they turned the water faucets on, and they asked, hey, this green dye come out? That was easy. Just put a black light on it, and if the water starts to glow, that tells you that the water from the Chicago River is in fact contaminating your source for the houses. And sure enough, the water started to glow. That says Chicago River is contaminating it, and they had to fix. There was a leak. It turns out the leak in the pipe allowed water from the Chicago River to get into the water source, and that's what was causing the outbreaks. So experimental. Experimental is also a field of epidemiology as well. In schools, if you want to study epidemiology, you'd go to the School of Public Health. Epidemiology is a branch of public health. So before a virus, bacterium, whatever, finds its way into a human body, it usually has to get there from some sort of reservoir. These reservoirs might be another animal. They might be a place where the infectious agent can live without being destroyed. So it might be living, might be non-living. Influenza virus, for example, can live in bodies of water for long periods of time. So these reservoirs of infection, they can be living, they can be non-living. Some of them can be human beings. We talked about typhoid Mary last time, Mary McCallum. I think thought your book might have had a story about Mary McCallum. I don't see it, but so you're going to have carriers that are human beings. Some of them can have an infection that is just not really apparent. They show no symptoms. They might be inherently resistant to it. Others might be intermittent carriers. They carry it sometimes. Others are chronic carriers that carry it all the time. Others can be animal carriers. Animal carriers. And then some reservoirs are just non-living, bodies of water, soils, things like that. Diseases we get from animals are called zoonotic infections. Zoonotic infections. Or they're just called zoonoses. Zoonoses. And your book has this really nice table. It's a big table of some of the different zoonotic infections, fungal diseases, parasitic infections, bacterial diseases, so on and so forth. This is essentially one place where you have an overlap between human and animal medicine. So vets can play a pretty robust role in public health because of the presence of zoonotic infections. Hantavirus, for example, hantavirus is carried by rodents. That's their reservoir, rodents. And whenever you get pine trees that release a lot of pinon nuts. Pinon nuts are the nuts released from the pine cones. Rodents, contrary to popular belief, rodents do not eat cheese. They eat seeds. They really like seeds, and pinon nuts are particularly tasty and attractive to a rodent. So when the pine trees release a lot of pinon nuts, rodent populations tend to explode, and the virus is released in the rodent urine. And so, and this was noticed actually by Navajo medicine men long ago, that when pine trees release a lot of pinon, there's a lot more illness in their villages. And that was due essentially to increased carriage of hantavirus by these rodents. All right, we'll move on from there. Portals of entry, portals of exit. So portals of entry, basically any of the places where your body opens to the outside world are potential portals of entry. This is probably pretty patently obvious to you, but the simple fact of the matter is, well, you can have portals of entry that are due to implants or injections or puncture wounds or something like that. Also, the placenta can be a portal of entry as well. For babies, there's some organisms that can pass the placenta. Others, mouth, nose, eyes, ears, that should be pretty obvious. And then, of course, genital as well, and then mammary glands as well. That is more a portal of exit, but it is a potential portal of entry, at least when a woman is breastfeeding, because there are infections that she can get called mastitis, entry through the nipple, at least in the mammary gland. Portal of exit, essentially any place where you produce any sort of secretions, nose, mouth, tears, ears, broken skin, and then any secretion from the GI or reproductive or urinary tract as well. Skin flakes as well. That might be a potential portal of exit as well. We talked about transmission before, so I won't belabor this too much. Again, contact, direct, indirect, or by droplet. Transmission from one person to another, that's horizontal transmission. If you get transmission through the placenta, that's called vertical transmission. Vertical transmission. Or sometimes you get transmission through childbirth. So in some places, when a baby's born, it's common to put some ointment, either neomycin or tetracycline ointment on the eyes, because chlamydia trachomatis causes trachoma of the eye, and if a baby gets that from an infected mother, the baby will have an infected conjunctiva and can go blind. That's an example also of vertical transmission as well. Direct transmission, of course, fecal-oral transmission, handshaking, contact with sores, sexual contact, kissing, any other form of direct contact, that would be an example of direct transmission. Indirect transmission is by means of contaminated objects. Remember, those are fomites. So these would be toys, dishes, eating utensils. Things that people commonly use. Clothes, microwave, gym equipment. We could brainstorm here, probably come up with a whole list. I talked about the difference between droplets and aerosols. You guys need me to rehearse that again, or are you good with that? Good? Okay, then I'll move on. Droplets are bigger than aerosol. Upshot of all that. Transmission by vehicles, also you can have airborne or waterborne transmission. Some viruses, of course, are transmitted via water, polio being the big one. Vectors. These usually are by means of some sort of biological entity. Usually, not always, but usually an arthropod. So mosquitoes are the biggie. Anopheles mosquitoes transmit malaria. Izodid or hard-body ticks transmit Rocky Mountain spotted fever. The body louse can transmit typhus. The rejuvid bug can transmit Chagas disease. These are all examples of biological vectors. And your book has what I think is a really nice set of pictures to illustrate contact, vehicle, and vector transmission. Again, vector transmission can be mechanical, like with flies. Or biological, as in the case of mosquitoes or ticks or whatever. If it bites you and injects it, it's biological. If it walks over something and then walks over your food, that's mechanical. That's mechanical. Okay. I think we've worked this over pretty nicely. Just droplets, don't forget. You see this online a lot. So let me just address this very briefly. So people will say, okay, look, the average mesh size of your mask is much larger than a virus particle. Now, is that true? Yeah, it is. It's true. But when we exhale and we have a viral disease, do we exhale naked virus? No. It's always encased in liquid. It's encased in a droplet. Droplets can be big or they can be small. The bigger droplets will tend to come out. They tend to evaporate. They fall. If they evaporate and become smaller, they can become wafted. Masks will block bigger droplets. The smaller droplets that come out will tend to evaporate very quickly, so your transmission over a long distance is very, very limited. There's a video online. People keep referring me to this blasted video. I don't know if any of you have seen this. This guy, he vapes through masks. You guys seen this video? So this gentleman, he vapes through masks, and he says, smoke particles that are vaping are the same size as the droplets that you exhale when you are sick. So he puts a mask on, he goes, then he vapes, and the smoke comes out like this. Now, the one thing he does not do is a control. If you don't have a control experiment, is your experiment worth anything? No. Everybody say this with me. An experiment without a control is balderdash. Okay, come on, say it, say it, say it. An experiment without a control, you believe that. Say it again with me. An experiment without a control is balderdash. This gentleman has no control experiment. In other words, smoke and goes. All of his smoke goes this far. It goes this far. I'll bet you if he took the mask off, the smoke would go really, really far. People keep referring me to that experiment, and they keep saying, guys, there's no control. This experiment is useless. Absolutely useless. This is the kind of science you're going to use to support science. You're going to use to support your contention. How about real science instead of baloney science? There. Got that out of my system. Okay, talked about that. Talked about that. All right. Now, the ability, you know what? Let's take our break right here. Then we'll dive into this. So let's take a break now. Then we'll dive into this afterwards, okay? Okay, so 5 minutes. Keegan, I got your email. I will reset it sometime today. How long do you need to get it done? So you can get it done by today? So if I set it for the end of the day, that'll do it? That's what I'll do. Okay. I just saw it this morning. I didn't get it before I came over. So. Okay, sports fans, time to resume. Some of the challenges involved with epidemiology, first of all, involve carriers. Does a carrier who has no symptoms know that they're a carrier? No. So how are you going to find out they're a carrier? Not likely. If you usually, someone will present themselves to the healthcare community when they're sick, but they don't show symptoms, they're not sick. So as far as they're concerned, they don't need your help. And you can't treat somebody who doesn't want to be treated. So therein lies the problem. If you have a population of carriers, the carriers show no symptoms, you're going to have a certain number of people who will always be able to distribute the disease, and they're just completely unaware of it. So carrier statuses can be an issue. Now, sexually transmitted diseases. Many of these can cause a disease, particularly in men, that don't produce really severe symptoms. Because of this, the guys don't know they're infected, but they can then go on and infect lots of other women. Again, it's like having a carrier. They will eventually go on to show symptoms months, or in some cases even years before they show symptoms. Same thing with women. The women may not show symptoms, and if they don't go in for a yearly pelvic exam, that's not going to be determined if in fact they have these diseases. Also, what if there is a certain amount of distrust of the healthcare community among certain populations who harbor these diseases? therein lies the rub as well. Also, zoonotic infections. You sometimes can't control the interaction between people and animals. Now, to give you an example of the way some people view animals, there you get these op-eds in the newspaper around here. I don't know if any of you read the local paper. If you don't, it's not a very good paper, but letters that come into the paper. So deer in Ellishark Park, too many deer have been a problem. So they'll usually have a couple. And the hunters will go out, they'll hunt the deer, they'll then dress the deer, and then the deer meat is actually given to the homeless shelters. But you get these articles, they'll say, you know, we should put food out for the deer. We should, feed them. We should, whatever. Now, this is, how do I put this nicely? This is moronic. Can you tell me why this is moronic? Deer are wild animals. This is not Bambi. They're wild animals, whether you know it or not. If you put food out, guess what they're going to expect from you? Food. What happens when you don't put it out? They're going to get mad. They're going to get aggressive. They don't think of you as their friend. Think of you as their buddy. They're wild animals, and they'll do what they need to do to survive. And if you're in the way, guess what? They'll try to get you out of the way. So there was a dear lady who had a raccoon that would just kind of show up in her driveway every night. So she put food out for it. Guess what happened? A couple nights later, now 2 raccoons show up. So she put a little more food out. Can you guess what happened? A few more raccoons show up, and a few more. Finally, she said, I can't afford this. So she stopped putting food out. You know what happened? The raccoons tore the screens off her windows. See, these are not your friends. These are wild animals. They'll do what they need to do. So if people go into national parks, sometimes they'll say, oh, let's pet the deer. Oh, let's feed the squirrels. Oh, let's give the squirrels my finger. Maybe he'll let me pet him. No, the squirrel's not going to let you pet him. The squirrel's going to take your finger and bite it. So maybe it's because I was raised on a farm. I just have a different view of wild animals. But people sometimes do some really dumb things when it comes to wild animals. What happens if you pet a wild deer? What are you at risk of getting? Starts with Lyme, ends with disease. Lyme disease. Because how do you get Lyme disease? Deer. So occasionally you'll get people coming in who just don't have a lot of experience with wild animals, and they just have this, excuse the expression, Disney view of wild animals. That wild animals are their friend, and so on and so forth. If we all just get along. If I'm nice to them, they'll understand me, blah, blah, blah. Please, 1, disabuse them of this view of wild animals. 2, test them for zoonotic diseases. And if you get a patient who says, I'm going to go camping, do please warn them of viewing wild animals as their buddies, because they're not their buddies. Other challenge, diseases sometimes go in cycles. I have a feeling we're seeing this with COVID-19. And COVID-19 is probably going to be a virus that'll be endemic in our population, and we're just going to have to learn to live with it. That's my view of COVID-19. Now, how far can a disease spread through the population? Depends on the group immunity, otherwise known as herd immunity. Herd immunity. If the population is not very immune, the thing will run rampant until people do get immune, then it'll decline. If 50% of the population is immune, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, then it will start to decline. If 90% of the population is immune, boom. This is the strategy behind vaccination. Herd immunity is well documented, not just in humans, but in wild populations as well. I literally had a person at a meeting I went to. This person was an anti-vax person. They told me herd immunity was a myth. And when they did that, I burst out laughing. Just because, I'm sorry, that was one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. And she looked at me very offended, and I said, what? You're kidding, right? She said, no, it's a myth. I couldn't believe my ears. Herd immunity will prevent a disease from penetrating very far into the population. This is probably what we're marching toward with COVID-19. It remains to be seen if COVID-19 lasts for very long. Some papers say no, others papers say it's hard to believe. Probably differs from person to person, would be my guess. So maybe COVID-19 will become seasonal with occasional spread outbreaks there, according to herd immunity at a particular time. Hard to say. So herd immunity is the strategy behind vaccination. That's the strategy behind vaccination. And those who don't vaccinate essentially are getting the benefit from those who do. However, those who don't vaccinate can become vectors of the disease to people who are susceptible. Infants, the aged, so on and so forth. And so that is worth warning people about. Okay, so what happens if you have some sort of outbreak? This is a graph of the outbreak, essentially, that you get in, is this the Russian one, or is this the Russian case, or is that the different? No, it's malaria. That's not the Russian one. In Russia, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, there was an outbreak of diphtheria, actually in many of the different provinces of the Soviet Union. And diphtheria, if you quarantine sick people, you can usually cut off diphtheria at the knees. You don't usually get diphtheria, people get sick. There's no two ways about it. You know people are sick. So quarantining sick people does a pretty good job of preventing the outbreak. This is an example of malaria outbreaks in the US. You'll notice that malaria cases are not that high. That doesn't mean that we don't have mosquito populations that can't carry it, but many of those mosquito populations were greatly diminished after the First World War because of spraying with DDT. DDT was overused, and it's in soils off the coast of California. It's the #1 pollutant you find in soils because it was so heavily overused. But it did kill a lot of mosquitoes. So many of these cases were usually due to people coming back from foreign wars. What we see now in the US are usually people who come into the country from foreign countries. We don't have a lot of mosquitoes, the Anopheles mosquitoes, that can carry it in many of these places. Because of that, these cases usually will always be low. But in cases like this, you're not going to get malaria that'll be transmitted from person to person. Isolating a person like this is really not necessary unless there are mosquitoes that can transmit it. Now, you can knock down malaria in a patient by using anti-malarial drugs, in which case then the tendency for them to transmit it will be very, very low. And you can see here the number of cases of malaria are really quite low in the United States and so on and so forth. There's just not that many cases. Per 100,000, yep, quite low. So vector control is another way you can prevent the transmission of diseases. Immunization, if you have a vaccine, is probably the most powerful tool in your armamentarium. Developing vaccines is labor intensive, time intensive, and is not cheap. Most of the vaccines that we have are distributed through a government program. The drug companies sell the vaccines to the government at cost. So this business, this conspiracy crap that you read on Twitter, that the drug companies just want to shoot you up with this stuff so they can get rich, is bull. They don't make hardly any money off vaccines. What they make money off are drugs that you need to take for the rest of your life. That's why, that's where their money is essentially being made. They don't make it off vaccines. So this conspiracy theory garbage that you read on Twitter is just that, it's garbage. Now, quarantining, is that going to help control somebody who's a carrier? Essentially is infected with it chronically. No. So quarantining is effective, but it's limited, isn't it? Isolation too, we saw this essentially with lockdowns here. Isolation can be a bit of a blunt instrument. Now, if you read the healthcare literature, they will say, well, look at China. China was able to get COVID-19 under control by having essentially almost a nationwide lockdown that were very, 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 very strictly enforced. And within 2 weeks, the number of cases were coming down. And through those lockdowns, China was essentially able to control the epidemic. There's a caveat in that, and it's this. Do you trust official Chinese numbers? I don't. Also, with those lockdowns, you have asymptomatic people, and China actually had another spike after the lockdowns were lifted. Was that spike reported? No, because the Chinese covered it up. It came out after people defecting from China told us about it. So do I trust the Chinese Information Bureau as far as I can throw it? No, and neither should you. Yet people will make hay out of those numbers, but it's based on bogus numbers because the government very clearly lied to us. And they had lots of help too from the World Health Organization. So isolation can be useful, but it's a blunt instrument. It's a blunt instrument. What's a better instrument essentially for controlling transmission? Usually it is isolation of specific individuals that you know are sick, like what was done in South Korea. So in South Korea, if you tested positive or if you had knowingly come into contact with someone who had tested positive, you essentially were picked up by a bus and taken to an apartment building, and there you would stay for 2 weeks. And then if you weren't sick, you showed no symptoms, you had no virus, you tested positive, tested negative, come home. that was not a nationwide lockdown. It was a targeted lockdown. So targeted lockdowns seem to be, or targeted isolation rather, seems to be a much better way to control infection than is kind of more mass lockdowns, mass isolation. So here is an example of kind of what you do. So private room, gloves must be worn, you wear your PPE, so on and so forth. Visitors check in, hands washed, blah, 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 so on and so forth. These are just ways essentially to prevent you from passing respiratory diseases, tuberculosis, enteric precautions during blah, 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 so on and so forth. And these are some of the different types of infections and the types of precautions you'll need to use and what have you. Strict, as you can see here. We'd probably put COVID-19 in here as well. Does anybody know off the top of your head the global lethality rate of COVID-19? 0.23%. 0.23%. That's composite for all ages, essentially. 0.23%. That's pretty low, isn't it? I think we get more bang for our buck if we protected susceptible populations like our aged, like people who are immunosuppressed, so on and so forth, than just trying to do this blunt instrument thing. And the data that keeps coming up over and over and over again, schools are not a big transmitter of this virus. For Pete's sake, people, open the schools. Open the schools. Even Nature magazine, Nature has been pretty alarmist about this epidemic. Even they said schools are not transmitting it. They're just not. So open the bloody schools. Okay, public health organizations. So in the States here, it's the CDC. Every doctor's office, every hospital will have the CDC on speed dial. And the reason for that is very simply, you have so-called notifiable infections that you have to call them about. Also, if you want the latest information about certain things, where do you go? You go to the CDC website. So, for example, I got my Shingrix vaccination for shingles. And then COVID, you're supposed to get the next shot within 6 months. Well, I got my shot in February. Great. So I went to my physical in August, and I said, well, I looked at the manufacturer's website. They said I probably have to start over. And then the doc sat there and said, he went click, 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 click. You know where he went? CDC website said, start over, just continue. He said, I'll trust them before I trust the manufacturer's website. So I just had my second shot and I was good. So that you should have on your phone ready to come up. If you need latest information about anything, you go to the CDC. For international medicine, it's a World Health Organization. And I hope to gosh they get new leadership over there, because they really beclown themselves in the COVID-19 epidemic. And this is the morbidity, mortality weekly report. And again, this can come into your mailbox every week. If you want it, you can sign up for it. And again, as far as I know, it's free. Congenital myopathy in New York, blah, 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 so on and so forth. It's usually not that long. Usually it's a good read. Yeah, so I'd recommend it to all of you. Notifiable diseases, diseases that have a tendency to either spread very quickly or cause a good deal of human suffering. You have to report them if a patient has them, and you have this list of these diseases. So syphilis, coccidioidomycosis, valley fever, cholera, brucellosis. They keep cutting. I don't know why they're cutting. Yeah, whatever. Legionellosis. What the deal is here, but yeah, whatever. Gonorrhea, giardiasis, whatever, what have you. The list you can read for yourself. If you have a patient with one of these, you have to contact the CDC, both for their records and also so that they know if there is an outbreak, essentially, what to do about that. So preventable deaths. Preventable deaths refer to deaths that are the result of some condition for which we have the means to prevent death, potentially at least. So let's say a patient, this happened actually when I was on a mission trip to Mexico. There was a baby, there was a young lady in the church in Mexico. Her baby died during the night while we were there. And the kid was fine the night. And I just asked her really briefly, I said, was Jesus sleeping a lot the night before, the day before? She said, yeah. Yeah, I said, was he able to lift his head? She said, yeah, he lifted his head, but he seemed to have a little bit of trouble. I didn't think anything of it. And lifting the head, stiffness of the neck, sluggishness, lethargy, that's probably meningitis, probably bacterial meningitis. Are there drugs to treat bacterial meningitis? Yeah, there are. So that was potentially preventable death. So anything essentially for which somebody dies, for which we have the means at least potentially to prevent the death. Now, could have been that it was too late. I don't know, but essentially because that particular death could have been prevented had the baby gotten the drugs at some period of time, that would have been classified as a preventable death. So things that prevent death, of course, childhood vaccinations would be way, way, way up there. EdNets, screens, other prevention, what have you, can prevent 50% of all malaria deaths. It turns out a bed net, there was actually a mission project. They, to get bed nets to parts of Africa. Oh, what was this? I can't remember the name of it, but there was a project. You take a bed and you imbue it with DEET, and then the bed net then repels the mosquitoes. The mosquitoes also can't get through the bed net. You sleep with the bed net and you won't, because Anopheles mosquitoes that transmit malaria, they tend to bite during the night. They don't tend to bite during the day. They come out at night and they do their biting. That's why a lot of these villages, you do all your work in the day. When it starts to become dusk, they go outside, they start a fire. And that leaf, it's hot, that'll keep the mosquitoes out. Culex mosquitoes that pass encephalitises, they bite during the day. Anopheles, they stand on their head when they bite. They don't bite like this. They literally, their whole body kind of goes like this, and they bite you like that. So, yeah, it's a tidbit of worthless information. Anyway, bed nets and other types of things, DEET, things like that, can prevent, say, 50% of all malaria deaths. Directly observed short course treatments. can prevent a lot of tuberculosis deaths. Do we have ways to screen for tuberculosis? Yeah, tuberculin skin test. Very cheap, very easy test to do. Can you treat someone who has primary tuberculosis? Yes, you can, with isoniazid. Integrated management of childhood illnesses, rehydration therapies, things for dysentery, things like that. Antibodies, HIV prevention, things like that. These are all potential courses that can essentially prevent death, and these are some of the things that you're starting to see implemented in resource-limited countries to try to get them back on track, essentially, because when do you get the most deaths usually in a population? It's in those very younger years. When the immune system is still developing, when you don't have immunity to lots of diseases, and also the child is subject to dehydration and other sorts of things from dysenteries and stuff like that. This is essentially what you're trying to prevent. Now, on the subject of preventable deaths, let's talk about infections acquired in the hospital. There's two sources of infection in a hospital: exogenous, endogenous. Exogenous, the patient brought it in with them. Example, let's say you're working ER. Ambulance comes in, somebody. They were in an accident. This person, however, is a homeless person with tuberculosis. What do they cough into? They cough into their clothing. So now their clothing is tuberculosis, with Mycobacterium tuberculosis. Let me tell you a little public health story. One that decreased tuberculosis in this country. One of them was Respidor. You guys know what Respidors are? Spittoons. Spittoons, because people used to have it. Used to chew tobacco, and when you chew tobacco, you need to expectorate. Expectoration is, that's expectoration, essentially. So they expectorate to a spittoon, a cuspidor. When you have tuberculosis, you can shed the tubercle in that fashion. The tubercle bacilli are very resistant to desiccation. While they sit in that cuspidor, they can then be aerosolized, and they can cause infection that way. Second feature was pasteurization of milk. Pasteurization of milk, because tuberculosis can associate with cows, can be shed in the milk. So pasteurization of milk also dropped tuberculosis cases precipitously. Now, you brought this patient in, they've got clothing loaded with Mycobacterium tuberculosis. It's resistant to desiccation. Get the patient's clothes off in a hurry, and you say they're light, you drop them on the floor. Now, say somebody goes and picks them up. They put them, say, in a bag. Whoosh, aerosol. Now, everyone in that room is exposed to tuberculosis who's not wearing a mask. You see the problem? That's exogenous. That's exogenous. It's brought in. Endogenous. Endogenous. It's in the hospital. It's in the hospital. What are some of the places such infections hide? I'm going to start calling on people. Medicals, okay, medical supplies. Medical supplies come from unwashed hands, people coughing and sneezing on it. Maybe got shipped in a good manufacturing practice, but maybe when it was shipped, was it the person who shipped it didn't practice wearing gloves and so on and so forth and what have you? So medical supplies. Where else? The floor. The floor. You didn't mop it as often, or and mop it with disinfectant. Like, ooh, big demerit. The floor. Also, maybe somebody tracked it in from their shoes. What do nurses normally do with respect to their shoes? They normally, come on, some of you guys worked at CNAs, you do this. You change your shoes when you come to work, right? One, you have to spend 12 hours. So you with a different pair of shoes, you'll have a pair of work shoes that you only wear at work. Nurses do that, decreases the amount of stuff you track into the hospital. So you come, you change your shoes, maybe you change them in the car, or you have a locker in some cases, you change them there, what have you. What's another source? Hand washing. And so by that I think lack of. Oh, lack of. So you touch patient, you're in a hurry, because nurses, you know, they get the other patient, you're like, oh, hi, I'm so. Do the hand washing thing. Ooh, costly mistake. Double the hand washing your hands. Hands. What else? Sorry? Food. Food. Now, the kitchens in hospitals are pretty heavily regulated. Really heavily regulated. But not everybody sometimes is observing what they should, and then people who bring the food to them. Also, in some hospitals, instead of the nurse bringing stuff to them, like you do in an ICU, some places like step down, they may just have stuff out. Want the patients to get up and walk. They may just leave it out and have the patient come get it. That could be because the patient themselves may not have washed it. Yeah, food will be another one. Stethoscope, or instruments in general. Instruments in general. Instruments are supposed to be autoclaved after they're used, right? Your cell phone? Yes, oh yes, oh yes, oh yes. Haley, what else? Waiting room, carpet. Those are supposed to be, hospitals usually have regulations on how often those are supposed to be cleaned, but yeah, carpet. Waiting rooms, chairs, couches. Ooh, couches can be loaded sometimes. Counters for the brochures sometimes. Boy, waiting room could be hot. What else?
I would say common areas like the or like the coffee.
Coffee. I'm not aware of anything, cups or coffee spreading anything in hospitals, but that's a potential. Maybe anyone heard of a case of coffee stations being case of spread in hospitals? I'm not aware of them. What else? What else?
Like if you don't change the medication.
Bedding, huge, especially if someone's been bleeding, especially if they're a burn patient or something like that. Oh yeah, you got to wash them, autoclave them, medically, big. What else? Bathrooms, yeah. As soon, if a patient, say, up or something like that, it's supposed to be cleaned right away, right? And if you can't do it, then you talk really nicely to your CNAs, and they do it, and they hopefully do it with a smile, because they're saving your hide. You've got other patients. But yeah, that's a biggie. Guys, you're missing one thing: ventilation. Ventilation, can that be a source of infection? Yeah, ventilation, that can be huge. So ventilation very often is you're going to have HEPA filters. HEPA filters. in hospitals. And those HEPA filters will, am I going the wrong way here? Yeah. Those HEPA filters essentially will prevent you from having essentially stuff being moved through the ventilation. Also, you won't usually have windows that are open in hospitals. Insects, if there's insects, you'll spray for those. Trash cans, usually not only do you have bags, but the trash cans themselves, it's not uncommon. You'll have a bag taken out, and then the janitor will take a squirt bottle of bleach usually and squirt the inside of the trash can and wipe it out as well. And then they'll wipe the outside of the trash can as well. Yeah, ventilation, elevators. Ooh, biggie, biggie. Elevators. The buttons, the floor, elevators, yeah. Elevator shafts too. But you can solve that by, oh, this blasted thing. You can solve that with HEPA filters, essentially making sure your HEPA filters are changed on a regular basis. Okay, other sites of infection, equipment, dialysis, implants, any sort of thing. Essentially, these are all things that contribute. Urinary tract, of course, the biggies here are Foley catheters. Foley catheters, boy, guys, observe those sterile fields really well. And then surgical wounds and what have you, that's a biggie too. And then you control this with hand washing, sterile equipment, glove use, observing sterile fields, and also big, 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 decrease unneeded antibiotic usage. Someone comes in with the flu, antibiotics going to help? No. Tell the patient no. If they give you grief, say it's still no. If they try to pull, oh, you just don't like me because I'm short or something like that, say the answer is still no. And no, you can't intimidate me by trying to be abusive. Bioterrorism is a specialized area of epidemiology. There are control measures put in place that usually only certain places have. If you have someone with a suspected bioterrorist agent, usually you call the CDC. That's usually something that is going to be, they'll be treated by people associated with DOD. There are DOD guidelines. You go to the DOD website for stuff like that. But DOD will usually tell local hospitals how to treat patients who are infected with suspected chemical or biological threats. That's usually where you go for that. And we got through it. All right. Friday, immune system, innate immunity. Okay, I'll see you on Wednesday.
Okay, thank you.